My name is Naomi. I'm 30 years old. And for the longest time, I truly believed I was building a life, not just surviving one. I married into the Whitman family 6 years ago, a family that prides themselves on appearances: the perfect lawn, the polished silverware, the curated smiles for holiday cards. I wasn't born into that kind of world. I was raised by a single mom who worked two jobs to keep the lights on, who taught me that real love is about showing up, not showing off. When I met Jason, my husband, he wasn't the cold man I know now. Back then, he was kind, charming, the type of person who made you feel seen, in a room full of people looking past you. I was young, hopeful, and foolish enough to believe that love alone could bridge the gap between where I came from and where he stood. I'm an artist, not the starving kind, though I had my share of ramen dinners. I run a small but steady studio tucked behind the house we shared, a quiet space where I could breathe when the expectations of the Whitman family started to suffocate me. That studio was my sanctuary, my safe place. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I gave, I was always the outsider. The polite smile, the tolerated presence. Never truly one of them. That all became painfully clear the night it fell apart. It was supposed to be a celebration, Jason's parents' wedding anniversary. One of those formal dinners where the table settings are so pristine, it feels like a museum display. The wine glasses so thin they could shatter with a sigh. Everyone was there: Jason, his parents, his sister Vanessa, a few cousins, even some distant family friends. I wasn't expecting affection, but I wasn't prepared for humiliation either. Halfway through dinner, as dessert plates were being cleared, Jason's father stood up to give one of his long winded toasts. I barely listened, tuning out the familiar sound of self importance. I kept my eyes on the centerpiece, a neat little arrangement of white roses. Then, out of nowhere, Jason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Cream colored, thick, the expensive kind you feel before you even open. He didn't say much, just placed it right in front of me. I looked at him, confused. "What's this?" My voice was steady, but my stomach dropped. Jason didn't blink. "Divorce papers," he said flatly, like he was commenting on the weather. For a second, the entire room froze. Even the crackling fireplace seemed to hold its breath. I reached out, my hand knocking over my wine glass as I grabbed the envelope. The glass hit the table hard, rolled, then shattered on the floor. Deep red wine bled across the white linen, and a sharp sting sliced across my palm where a piece of glass caught my skin. I felt the blood trickle down my hand, but honestly, the cut was the least of my pain. The real wound was watching the faces around that table. Not one person looked shocked. No one gasped. No one asked what was happening. Instead, they stared at me. Some curious, some smug, a few looking almost pleased. Vanessa, Jason's sister, leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine like she was enjoying a show. "Honestly, Naomi," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm, "I'm surprised you lasted this long." A soft wave of laughter followed. Even a couple of cousins I thought were neutral couldn't hide their grins. I turned to Jason, searching his face for some sign of regret, some flicker of the man who once stayed up late helping me stretch canvases, who told me he believed in my art when no one else did. But there was nothing. Just that same blank, indifferent expression. And then Jason's mother, Evelyn, finished the job. She set her fork down gently, the soft clink of silver against china cutting through the air. "Naomi," she said, her tone smooth and practiced, "it's time you face the truth. You were never really one of us." Her words hit harder than the glass ever could. I should have broken right then. I should have fallen apart, sitting there bleeding in front of them. But instead, something else rose up inside me, something steady, something I didn't know I had. Because what they didn't know, what they never even bothered to ask, was that tucked away inside my purse that night, hidden beneath my lipstick and keys, was a copy of the deed to our house, signed over to me almost a year ago on the night of our anniversary, when Jason had one too many drinks and made a promise he never thought I'd hold him to. But I did. I stood up slowly, pressing a napkin to my hand, watching the red soak through the fabric. My voice was calm when I spoke. "You're right," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "I don't belong here." I turned to Jason last. "But I promise you this. You're going to regret underestimating me." And with that, I walked out, past their perfect table, past the family portraits that never included me. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. Because in that moment, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of something they never saw coming. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. Instead, I sat on the couch at Lindsay's apartment, my hand neatly bandaged, my mind wide awake, sharp like glass edges. Lindsay, still pacing back and forth in the tiny kitchen, kept asking if I was okay, but I wasn't. I wasn't hurt. I was focused. I was done playing the quiet, polite outsider they thought they could crush without consequence. The moment I walked out of that dinner, I knew exactly what I needed to do. No screaming, no begging, no asking for explanations. That wasn't my language anymore. I spoke through action now. The deed transfer, tucked away for months, was my ace. Signed legally by Jason himself on a night he barely remembered, but one I never forgot. The house, the estate they called their pride, had been mine on paper for nearly a year, and now it was time to make it real. At sunrise, I called Gloria, my attorney. Sharp, calm, and terrifying in court, Gloria was the type of woman who didn't waste words. She picked up after 2 rings. "Ella," she said, already alert. "It's time," I told her. Just 2 words, but she understood immediately. By noon, she was at Lindsay's apartment with a thick folder of documents, every page stamped, signed, sealed. The plan was clear: confirm the ownership filing at the local registrar, then issue a formal eviction notice to the Harringtons. 30 days to vacate. Legal. Irrefutable. I remember sitting across from Gloria at Lindsay's dining table, watching her flip through the pages like it was just another day at the office. But to me, it wasn't. To me, it was the first breath of real power I'd ever tasted. "Are you sure about this, Ella?" she asked, looking up over her glasses. I didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." By that evening, the paperwork was filed. The next day, I didn't sneak back to the house like some guilty ex-wife looking to pick up forgotten things. Number I arrived at the estate as its rightful owner, head held high, coat neatly pressed, papers in hand. When Jason opened the door and saw me standing there, his expression flickered. Confusion first, then irritation, and finally, fear. He stepped aside, silent. Inside, the living room smelled of lavender and expensive candles. The furniture perfectly arranged, as if nothing had happened. Evelyn was sitting on the cream-colored couch, a cup of tea in hand, as though she were entertaining royalty. She didn't rise when I walked in. She didn't even flinch. "What is this now, Naomi?" she asked, her voice laced with boredom. I set the envelope down on the coffee table between us. 30 days, I said evenly. "This property has been legally mine since last year. You have until the end of next month to leave." There was a pause, a long, heavy silence, as the words settled into the room like smoke. Jason's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around the delicate china teacup. "This is absurd," she hissed. "You're bluffing." Gloria had prepared me for this moment. I pulled out the notarized copy of the deed, held it steady between 2 fingers, and placed it directly in front of Evelyn. "You can have your lawyer verify it, but I assure you every line is airtight. Signed by Jason, witnessed." Filed for the first time, Evelyn's mask cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but it was enough. I turned toward Jason, who still hadn't spoken. His jaw clenched, his eyes glued to the papers on the table. "You handed me those divorce papers like I was disposable," I said softly. "But you forgot one thing, Jason. I'm not disposable, not anymore." I didn't stay to argue. I didn't wait for their shouting or their scrambling to find loopholes. I walked out just as calmly as I had the night before, leaving the weight of my words behind me. They weren't ready for this version of me, the woman who didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't fold, and as I closed the door behind me, I felt it fully for the first time. The shift in power. The turn of the story. They thought they were writing my ending, but they didn't realize I was the one holding the pen. The next morning, the Harrington house sat quiet, blinds still drawn, the way cowards hide from daylight. But for the first time, I walked up those stone steps not as an unwanted guest, not as the charity case daughter in law they could look down on, but as the rightful owner of every tile beneath their feet. This wasn't their sanctuary anymore, it was mine. The knock at the door was deliberate, steady. When Jason finally opened it, there was no fight in his face, only the blank exhaustion of someone who knew they'd already lost. I handed him a second copy of the eviction notice. "You have until the end of the month," I said quietly. "And this time, Jason, there's no Mildred to twist the rules." Inside, I could hear the soft clinking of cutlery, the morning routine undisturbed. Mildred's voice floated from the dining room, cool and rehearsed. "I assume you're here to make more noise," she called out, not even bothering to stand. I stepped through the doorway, watching her lift her teacup like we were discussing the weather. Julie sat beside her, eyes downcast, rubbing a slow circle over her swollen belly. No smirk today. Mildred's gaze finally met mine. "I'll have my lawyers handle this nonsense," she said, her words sharp as polished knives. I smiled. "Please do. But they'll find what your pride refuses to accept. You don't own this house. You never did. And your name means nothing here without my permission." The flash of panic behind her eyes was brief, but it was there. She placed the cup down carefully, fingers tighter than necessary around the handle. "You won't get away with this, Ella," she whispered, venom threading every syllable. I didn't flinch. I leaned in, voice steady, low, deadly clear. "I'm not getting away with anything. I'm standing exactly where I belong." There it was, the moment the ground shifted. Not with shouts or slammed doors, but with the undeniable weight of truth dropped in the center of the room like a stone. Julie looked up, eyes wide, a flicker of realization dawning behind the fear. "Jason?" He didn't even meet my gaze. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed down the front of his shirt. Useless motions for a man who'd lost control. I left them there, sitting in that suffocating silence, and walked out to the back of the estate. The place they'd dismissed as my little art studio, the side project they never respected. But they never understood what that space really was. It wasn't a distraction, it was my foundation. I unlocked the door to the studio, sunlight pouring in through the tall windows, landing on my easel, my brushes, my half-finished sketches. This wasn't just a workspace, it was my stand, my claim. The proof that while they tried to strip me of worth, I had been quietly building it brick by brick behind their backs. From my bag, I pulled the final draft of the floor plans I'd spent months perfecting. The conversion designs were all there, the gallery layout, the restoration studio, the exhibit rooms. Every square foot of the Harrington estate was about to be transformed from a monument to their arrogance into a place of light, creation, and truth. And the best part? They couldn't stop it. That afternoon, the contractor team arrived, licensed, bonded, scheduled months in advance. I stood at the front gates as the trucks rolled in, watching the Harrington family stare from the windows like ghosts trapped in a house no longer theirs. When Mildred finally stormed out onto the lawn, her heels stabbing into the soft earth, she waved her hands wildly at the crew. "I didn't approve this. You can't just barge in here like this." The lead contractor didn't even look at her. Instead, he turned to me and asked politely, "Mrs. Harrington, where would you like us to begin?" I smiled, slowly unfolding the plans. "Start with the dining room. Because if they wanted to hand me divorce papers at Thanksgiving dinner, then the first thing to go would be the table where they tried to break me. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. And they were going to watch every second of it." The first swing of the hammer echoed through the estate like thunder cracking through an old sky. The sound was raw, deliberate, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I never got to finish. The dining room, the stage of my humiliation, was the first to fall. The heavy mahogany table that once seated the family council, where whispered judgments were served alongside dessert, was dismantled plank by plank. I stood by the archway, watching as each piece of their so-called tradition was carted out the door. There was no anger in my chest, only clarity. This wasn't destruction, it was liberation. The contractor crew worked swiftly, respectful, but curious. I could feel the questions hovering behind their polite nods, but no one asked. They didn't need to. The plans taped to the walls spoke for themselves. A complete redesign of the Harrington Mansion into the Haven, an art restoration and exhibition space, unlike anything the city had ever seen. What was once a fortress of arrogance was being carved open, room by room, to let in air, light, and life. The Great Hall, once guarded by portraits of stiff necked ancestors, would become the main gallery, sunlight pouring through a newly designed skylight. The side wings were to be converted into intimate workshop spaces, places where hands could work, learn, and heal. I imagined the sound of brushes against canvas replacing the silence of unspoken scorn. I imagined laughter where there had once been judgment. Professor Bennett visited the site on the third day of renovation. He walked through the stripped down entryway with slow, deliberate steps, running his fingers along the bare studs where wallpaper had been peeled away. "You're not just remodeling a house," he said, his voice soft. "You're restoring yourself." I didn't reply. I just smiled and handed him the detailed restoration schedule for the studio spaces. Each room had its purpose. The West Wing would house a restoration lab, fully equipped for conserving delicate oil paintings, tapestries, and antique frames. Artworks like the ones Mildred had once sneered at, calling my passion a childish waste of time. The East Wing would hold classrooms for local artists, especially those overlooked by mainstream galleries. Scholarships were already lined up, funded in part by the very collector who once dismissed my work as too sentimental. I worked long days, sometimes forgetting to eat, often losing track of time. But for the first time in years, my exhaustion felt clean, purposeful. Lindsay stayed by my side through it all, showing up with coffee, coordinating vendors, and reminding me to rest when my stubbornness overpowered my common sense. "You know," she said one night as we reviewed flooring samples, "I don't think I've ever seen you this alive." It was true. Every tile laid, every beam reinforced, every brush stroke on the new walls felt like stitching a wound I'd carried for too long. This wasn't about spite. It was about reclaiming space, not just physical, but emotional. I wasn't erasing the past. I was giving it context. The crew discovered a box of old family photographs buried behind a false wall in the attic. Formal portraits, posed and perfect, the Harrington name stamped boldly beneath each frame. I sorted through them, fingers brushing over the faces that once looked down on me with thin smiles. But instead of tossing them away, I set them aside. They would remain in storage. Not a weight. By the fourth week, the skeleton of the Haven began to take shape. The gallery walls stood clean and white, ready to hold not just paintings, but the stories of artists who'd been told they didn't belong. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the scent of sawdust, a strange but comforting perfume of new beginnings. Outside, the garden that Mildred once made me weed as punishment was being transformed too. Native wildflowers were planted along the stone paths. A small sculpture garden was designed in the corner, with benches placed beneath blooming magnolias. The same trees I used to stare at through tear-filled eyes after another cutting remark at family dinners. One afternoon, as I stood beneath the half-finished archway of what would become the main entrance, Lindsay walked up beside me. "You ever think they'll understand what this really means?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "It doesn't matter if they understand. It matters that I do." The grand chandelier that once hung over the dining room table, the same one that sparkled above my humiliation, was taken down piece by piece. I saved the crystals, not to keep as trophies, but to repurpose into a light installation for the entryway. Broken pieces, reframed into something beautiful. Because that's what this was about. Not revenge, not destruction. Rebirth. Opening night at the Haven arrived beneath a soft blanket of winter fog, the kind that made the city lights glow like distant stars through the haze. Outside the newly transformed estate, a line of guests wrapped around the block, their coats dusted with frost, their breath rising like smoke into the night air. Reporters gathered at the entrance, cameras perched on tripods, microphones waiting like hungry birds for the first words of the evening. Inside, the former Harrington mansion no longer resembled the suffocating space where judgment once sat heavy in the air. Golden light spilled from sconces lining the walls, casting warmth on the brick and plaster that had been lovingly restored. Framed canvases, vivid, defiant, tender, hung, where portraits of stern ancestors once loomed. Pieces created by hands that had been told no, not good enough, too soft, now claimed their space unapologetically. I stood just behind the soft velvet curtain of the backstage area, my hands lightly gripping the edges of a folded speech, though I knew every word by heart. Across the hall, I caught a glimpse of Lindsay moving between guests, her emerald dress catching the light as she whispered to the press and answered questions with the ease of someone who believed in every step we'd taken to get here. She gave me a subtle nod, a quiet confirmation that everything was ready. The clock struck 8, and the chime signaling the start of the event echoed gently through the gallery. Conversations hushed. Footsteps softened against the hardwood floors as people gathered beneath the newly installed skylight, the stars faint above, but the glow of the haven brighter than ever below. I stepped forward, the curtain drawn back, the podium waiting. The applause was polite at first, expectant, curious, but I didn't rush. I looked out at the crowd, curators, critics, collectors, young artists whose hands had helped sand these very floors. And there, near the back, I saw a few familiar faces from years past, the same gallery owners who once sent my applications back unopened. Now they stood among the guests waiting for me to speak. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began, my voice steady, my breath even. This place, the Haven, was once a house built on tradition, on silence, on expectations so tightly wound that they smothered anything that didn't fit the mold. For years, this was not a home, but a stage, a place where power sat at the head of the table and difference was met with disdain. I paused, letting the words settle like dust after a storm. But tonight, I continued, this space belongs to a different kind of legacy. One not written in stone or bloodlines, but in brushstrokes, in color, in the raw truth of human expression. I turned toward the centerpiece of the exhibit, a towering canvas, still draped beneath a black cloth. Its size alone commanded attention, but what lay beneath was not just art. It was memory. It was my story, finally told in my own language. This piece, I said, gesturing toward it, is called Reclamation. It took me a year to complete, a year of sleepless nights, of confronting doubt, of stitching together the shards of something broken until it could stand on its own. I gave the signal. 2 gallery assistants stepped forward and slowly pulled the cloth away. Gasps rippled through the room as the painting revealed itself, a flipped dining table at its center, shattered crystal scattered across the floor, reflections of countless faces caught in each broken piece of glass. Some faces wept, some screamed, some stared blankly forward. And in the middle, rising from the wreckage, stood a woman holding a single paintbrush. Her gaze was steady, unyielding, forward-facing, not defeated, not pleading, reclaimed. This is not a portrait of revenge, I said softly into the mic. It is a portrait of survival, of voice, of dignity. Silence held the room for a long moment. Before applause began, soft at first, then swelling, a wave that filled every corner of the hall. In the front row, I caught the eye of one of the critics from the Boston Review. His expression changed from skepticism to something resembling respect. A collector from New York leaned toward Lindsay, whispering words I didn't need to hear to understand their meaning. But it wasn't their approval I was waiting for. The doors at the back of the room creaked open. Heads turned. And there they stood, Mildred Harrington, upright as ever but with a stiffness in her spine that spoke more of defeat than pride. Behind her, Brandon and Julie followed quietly, Julie's pregnancy now impossible to hide beneath her coat. Their presence felt like a storm cloud moving into a sunlit sky, but I stood on my ground. I thought this was a public space. Mildred's voice cut through the air, icy, rehearsed. Of course, I answered, smiling calmly. Everyone's welcome here, even those who once called art a waste of time. The tension crackled, but I didn't flinch. I turned my gaze back to the audience. This space is not built on exclusion. It's built on truth. Mildred opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the applause rose again. Louder this time, stronger. Cameras flashed. Reporters turned their attention to the confrontation, their pens poised like arrows. And then, from the side of the room, a familiar voice broke the stalemate. "Mrs. Harrington," said the lead curator from the New England Museum of Fine Arts, stepping forward, "your son should be proud. We're considering this piece as the opening feature in next year's exhibit, Women and the Voice." Mildred's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Julie looked down at the floor. Brandon stood motionless, his eyes dark, unreadable. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. I raised my glass quietly, turned to Lindsay, and offered a toast. To the words that once broke me, and I said, now the foundation of something new. And beneath the high ceilings of what was once a house of judgment, the applause echoed, not just for me, but for every voice that had ever been told to stay silent. The applause of opening night was still echoing in my mind when the first headline broke just 3 days later. I was in my office at the Haven, leafing through exhibit proposals from young artists, when Lindsay's voice crackled urgently through the phone. "Ella, turn on the TV, Channel 9, right now." I reached for the remote, my hand steady, but my breath catching as the bold red headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Harrington Capital under investigation for financial misconduct. Millions missing. The anchor's voice was grave, deliberate. Sources confirmed that Mildred Harrington, CEO of Harrington Capital, and her son Brandon Harrington are currently under federal investigation for embezzlement and misuse of client funds. Reports suggest that several properties, including the historic Harrington family estate at Willow Creek, were leveraged illegally in the scheme. I stared at the screen, the room suddenly too quiet, the weight of the news settling into my chest like a heavy stone. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, not revenge. It was something colder, deeper, a sharp-edged awareness of how close I had come to losing everything I had built. If I hadn't secured the deed transfer when I did, my haven might have been seized, not celebrated. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Gloria, my lawyer, her voice brisk but tinged with relief. "Ella, good thing you filed all the paperwork when you did. I double-checked. Your property is clear. If you'd waited even a few more weeks, the FBI would have listed it among Harrington Capital's assets." I nodded slowly, staring out the window at the courtyard where a group of young artists were prepping canvases for the next workshop. They worked unaware of the storm swirling outside these walls. And for the first time, I truly understood the power of the foundation I had secured. Not just legally, but emotionally. This place was mine, untouchable. Meanwhile, the news cycle fed on the Harrington scandal like vultures at a feast. Daily updates revealed more layers of corruption, misappropriated trust funds, ghost investments, private accounts hidden offshore. The house of cards was collapsing, and the world was watching. Brandon's name surfaced repeatedly in the reports, but each time it was accompanied by the same phrase: cooperating with investigators. It wasn't hard to imagine the scene. Brandon pointing fingers, laying blame at the feet of his mother to salvage whatever scraps of reputation he could. By the following week, a new headline emerged: Julie Harrington, named in subpoena request. Her connection through joint accounts and property transactions had tied her to the investigation, even as she quietly retreated from the family spotlight. I was wiping down one of the new gallery displays when my phone rang again. This time, it was a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. "Ella?" The voice on the other end cracked, brittle. "Julie." There was a long silence before she spoke again, and when she did, her words fell out in a rush. I I have nowhere else to go. Brandon's frozen our accounts. My mother's been subpoenaed. I'm about to give birth and I don't have a home. I don't have anyone." The irony was sharp, almost too much to bear. This was the same woman who had smirked at me across holiday tables, who had laughed when Mildred called my work a hobby. And now here she was, stripped of privilege, pride dissolved, asking for mercy. I didn't answer right away. My fingers tapped against the armrest of the studio chair as my mind flickered through memories, the cruelty, the dismissal, the humiliation. But behind her voice, beneath desperation, I heard something else. Fear. Not for herself, but for the child who hadn't chosen any of this. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm but clear. There's a guest house behind the garden. It's small but clean. I'll have the code reset. You can stay there. Until you find your way. Julie choked back to what sounded like a sob. I know I don't deserve it. Thank you, I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. 3 hours later, headlights swept across the gravel driveway outside the Haven. I watched through the window as Julie climbed slowly out of an aging silver car, her belly round beneath an oversized sweater, a single canvas bag slung over her shoulder. No designer coats, no polished nails, just a woman stripped down to the raw truth of her own undoing. When I opened the gate, she didn't meet my eyes. She only whispered, I'm sorry. And that was enough. Not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, but a step. The Harrington empire continued to crumble as investigations dug deeper. Mildred, once untouchable, now faced deposition after deposition. Her face, once broadcast with pride on the covers of business magazines, now splashed across the news beneath headlines like Matriarch of Misconduct. And while they scrambled, deflected, pointed fingers, the Haven stood still, serene, untouched, a mama lighthouse standing tall as their ship sank beneath the waves. But I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate their ruin, because what I had built was never about tearing them down. It was about standing tall on my own. When Lindsay called me that Friday, her voice was softer than usual. Have you seen the latest? I have, I replied, eyes on the quiet garden outside my window, where Julie now sat on the porch of the guest house, her hand resting gently on her belly. This was never about revenge, was it? Lindsay asked. No, I said, closing my laptop with finality. It was about making sure that when the old empire fell, I was standing far enough away that the dust didn't choke me. And I was. The winter snow had begun to thaw, giving way to soft green shoots pressing up through the soil around the garden paths of the Haven. The world outside was still tangled in headlines and court updates about the Harrington downfall, but here, within these walls, something entirely different was unfolding. A quiet, steady rebuilding. Julie kept to the guest house, true to her word. There were no demands, no expectations. She enrolled herself in a short course on antique painting restoration, often spending hours in the studio, listening, watching, asking questions. One afternoon, I passed by and saw her carefully mending the cracked edge of a student's discarded canvas. She didn't know I was watching, but in that moment, I saw something in her that had never been there before. Humility. When her son arrived, a healthy baby boy with eyes the color of the late afternoon sky, she named him Isaac, a name that meant laughter. Perhaps her way of wishing him a future free from the bitterness of the past. The first time I saw her holding him on the porch, rocking him gently as the wind rustled the lavender beds, I felt a shift. Not forgiveness in the traditional sense, but a softening, an understanding that healing often looks different from what we expect. Meanwhile, Mildred returned as promised. She showed up on time every Monday, wearing simple clothes, no designer labels, her hair pulled back plainly. She worked quietly, entering data, cleaning frames, and asking questions when she didn't know the process. She didn't try to reclaim power. She didn't ask for special treatment. For the first time, she was just a present. There was one afternoon, as we prepared a new exhibit on women artists of the early 20th century, when I found her standing in front of a portrait of a young immigrant woman holding a palette and brush. Her eyes were glassy. She didn't speak, but the moment hung heavy between us. She understood now, in a way she never had before, the weight of dreams dismissed too easily. One late evening, as the apprentices packed up their supplies and the last of the light faded through the skylight, Mildred approached me at my desk. She held out a folder, her application to enroll in the evening restoration course we offered at the Haven. I don't want exceptions, she said, voice steady. I want to learn like everyone else. I nodded and took the folder without a word. Growth wasn't about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about showing up every day, doing the small work, and letting time fill in the cracks. As the seasons turned, the Haven blossomed. Our community workshops were full, with lines of visitors winding down the sidewalk on weekends. Local schools brought students on field trips. Emerging artists sent portfolios, asking for mentorship and space to showcase their work. The Smithsonian partnership moved forward, and my inbox filled with inquiries from galleries as far as Europe and Japan. But none of that meant as much as the simple, everyday moments: the quiet hum of artists at work, the smell of fresh varnish, the laughter of children during our free youth classes. This was the life I had imagined, not one controlled by someone else's approval, but built on the foundation of my own voice. Julie continued to live in the guest house for several months after Isaac was born, but eventually, true to her promise, she saved enough to move into a small apartment nearby. Before she left, she sat across from me at the studio kitchen table, Isaac asleep in his carrier beside her. I know I can never erase what I said. What I did, she began quietly. But I want you to know you taught me more than anyone else ever has about grace, about what real strength looks like. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I poured us both tea and simply said, "The real work begins after the apology. Keep going." She nodded, eyes brimming, and left with the dignity of someone genuinely ready to change. Mildred, too, continued to show up. Over time, her posture softened. She stopped walking like she owned the space and started moving like she belonged. There was one evening, near the end of the first quarter's restoration course, when she approached me, eyes bright but weary. "Thank you," she said, voice small, "for letting me stay, for not slamming the door." I met her gaze steady. "You stayed because you earned it, Mildred, not because I owed it." I could see the truth of it hit her. She simply nodded and walked back to her station, picking up where she left off. The Haven's spring exhibition launched with the theme Rebuilding from Ashes. The gallery filled with works of art that spoke of loss, recovery, and rebirth. Pieces scarred and stitched back together, brush strokes bold and unapologetic. In the center of the room stood my own latest painting, a diptych. On one side, a cracked porcelain figure, her face fractured but her eyes burning brightly. On the other hand, hands mending the pieces, not hiding the seams but gilding them, turning the breaks into beauty. The opening night was quieter than the first, but richer somehow. The audience knew the story beneath the brushstrokes. They could feel it. As the evening drew to a close, Lindsay raised a glass beside me. "To reclamation," she said, smiling. I clinked my glass softly against hers, but my eyes drifted to the painting, to the golden seams, to the reflection of the faces gathered here tonight. Faces of those who once doubted, some who hurt, and others who learned. This was never about revenge. It was never about proving anything to the Harringtons. It was about this: a home remade, a voice reclaimed, a future rewritten, not by erasing the past, but by transforming it. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be, and that was enough.